am I going to hear an introduction on?
This is Touch of Health Ministry. We tonight have Dr. Mills speaking for us. We hope that you get every answer answered, every question answered, and we're listening for the information that we need at this present time that we're living in. So Dr. Mills is going to give us the information we need. He's going to feed us. So Dr. Mills also a vegan, a physician, Dr. Milton Mills, and for food and health. And that's what we need at a time like this. So our bodies will be in good shape to be able to do what God wants us to do. Dr. Mills is also a renowned physician and lecturer and served as associate director of medicine, preventive medicine at the what's that?
Physicians Committee.
Committee. Okay, responsible for medicine. Okay, Dr. Mills, it's probably a lot more than you could say better than I could say it.
Yeah, no, that's all. That's fine. Well, number one, I am glad to be with you guys tonight. This is an honor and a blessing to talk about the importance of the health message that God has given us as some of the Adventists, even though oftentimes, like other gifts that God has given us, we don't really appreciate the importance of it. I think it's especially important for us to understand that the health message is an integral part of the third angel's message. It's not an optional part. It's not like when you buy a car and they say, well, you can get the turbo, but you don't have to. And no, this is an integral part of our message. And we're going to talk about why it's an integral part of our message. Clearly, I think most people understand that healthier diet promotes better health, but it goes far beyond that, because there's a very interesting dialogue in the book of Genesis that points out God's concern about our health, but also the fact that his concern about our health goes beyond just physical health. And people may or may not remember, after Adam and Eve sinned, God and Jesus were talking, and they said, well, we have got to put the man and woman out of the Garden of Eden, lest they put forth their hand and eat from the tree of life and become eternally living sinners. And what that tells us is that, number one, as the Bible says, God only has immortality. Our ability to be immortal derives from the access to the tree of life, which its fruit rebuilds, restores, and extends life indefinitely. And what that exchange tells me is that if God was only concerned about our health, he would have let Adam and Eve keep eating from the tree of life. But clearly he didn't want that. But he gave us instructions about our diet, both before and after the fall, because he does want us to be healthy. And in some respects, once human beings sinned, what we ate became even more important, in a sense. And the reason is, God would come down to the earth in the evening and commune with Adam and Eve face to face every day. But once humans became sinful, we could no longer stand in the presence of God, because God is to send a consuming fire. So that meant that our interaction with him had to occur through our mind, through the agency of the Holy Spirit speaking to us within our mind. Well, why? What does that mean? That means that if your mind is confused and inflamed and filled with all sorts of toxins and unhealthy foods, the quality of your interaction with God is going to be degraded. So it is extra important that we have as clear minds as we possibly can so that we can have unfettered and interaction with the Holy Spirit, and we will be able to hear what God is trying to tell us. So with that, and I'm going to talk about that and where that place, that place is within the Advent message as we get started. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. And our society, as we often know, is obsessed with finding cures without trying to focus on the causes of disease. Everybody, I as a physician, it really troubles my heart when I see all of these, run for breast cancer, writing for this disease, campaigning for that disease, when nobody is asking what's causing these diseases and can we prevent them? And as this slide is meant to demonstrate, it's clearly what we put in our bodies that determine, to a large extent, what diseases we end up suffering from. And that's why the Bible tells us that a man's own folly ruins his life, yet his heart rages against the Lord. And how many times when people receive a diagnosis of, cancer, heart disease, or some other really debilitating, life-threatening condition, the first thing they do is look up and yell, "Oh Lord, why me?" Or they direct anger at God as though he did this to us. Well, we know that the Bible tells us that God created us to be plant-based beings. And if we willfully depart from that and instead choose to eat things that our bodies were never designed to handle, instead of saying, "Oh Lord, why me?" we should be saying, "Oh Lord, why not me? What took you so long for me to develop this disease? Because I knew I was doing what I shouldn't have been doing." So rather than raging against God, what I hope is that people will come away with an understanding of what God wants us and designed us to eat, and understanding how adhering to that diet will help us avoid a lot of the diseases we see in the United States and other Western countries. Now, this is a little Dilbert cartoon, and he's talking to his dog. He says, "Dogbert, I don't understand why you or anybody would become a vegetarian." And so Dogbert says, "You mean why don't I take dead animals, cook them until they become cancer-causing, carcinogenic, then eat them instead of something nutritious? Is that your question?" He said, "Exactly. Is there any good reason? Have you joined a cult?" He said, "Well, I live in Loma Linda." So, and we understand this is where a large proportion of Seventh-day Adventists live. And there are two major studies that have been done on the Adventist Church, Adventist 1 and Adventist 2, and they've shown some very, very important findings. And before I even get to that, let me point out that there is research known as blue zone research. And blue zones were areas around the world when scientists who were interested in human health and longevity looked around the world. There were several places around the world in different countries where they noticed that people tended to live well into their 80s and 90s and beyond, that they had a much lower risk for cancer, heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, stroke, all of the diseases common in Western countries. And very importantly, they had a much lower risk of developing dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and they remained more active and functional throughout their lives. So they decided, we need to examine these groups of people and find out what is it that they're doing that allows them to have these advantages in life. And interestingly, there is only one blue zone in the United States. and that is Loma Linda. And that is because of the high proportion of vegetarians and vegans in that Adventist population. And another really important point is that the Blue Zone data shows that the closer a population gets to a plant-based diet or an entirely plant-based diet, the healthier they are and the longest they live. So they looked at people in the Mediterranean, they looked at people living in Okinawa and in several other places around the world. And what they found was that the longest lived people were those Seventh-day Adventist plant-based individuals. And so let's look at some of the findings from the Adventist health studies. So what they showed was that vegetarian Adventist men in California live almost 10 years longer on average. So that means that some people do much better than that than non-Adventist men who eat meat. The Adventist women who were plant-based lived more than 6.5 years longer on average. Now, I always point out to people, this does not mean being plant-based is better for men than it is women. It's just that for the ladies, you guys already outlive us. And so there's just less room for improvement. But it's great for both men and women. The plant-based Adventists had lower risk of all of the major cancers, colon, breast, prostate, stomach cancer, and kidney cancers, lower risk of heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, metabolic syndrome, and elevated cholesterol. And in general, they had a lower risk of dying from any cause. So that means that being plant-based helps you not get on the freeway and drive like an idiot, because they had a lower risk of dying from being in a car accident. So it's truly beneficial across the board. And this scripture is from Psalms. It says, "Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary." Are you guys not able to see my slides? I need someone to speak to me. Are you not seeing the slides?
We can see your slides. It's just your video that's muted. I'm sorry about that.
You say the video that's muted.
You can't see. Your video is off. I'm sorry. If you could just turn your video on.
Oh, I'm sorry.
My apologies.
No, it's okay. I'm not sure how it got turned off, but let me fix that. Give me a minute, because it says I'm screen sharing. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop the screen share. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure how my video got turned off, but all right.
That was my fault, sorry.
No problem. This scripture is from the book of Proverbs. With all that getting, get understanding, and hopefully that is what we will achieve tonight. So what is important about the sanctuary? Oh, come on. Now, okay, there we go. All right. Well, as we know, God communicates with us through our mind, as I mentioned before, and our mind, which is where we are housed, is housed within the substance of our brains. And that means the ability of God to communicate with us and the quality of that interaction will be directly affected by the health and functioning of our brain. So what does this have to do with the sanctuary? Many people think that the central truth or the central important doctrine of the Seventh-day Adventist faith is the doctrine of Sabbath keeping and the Ten Commandments. But it isn't, because the Ten Commandments by themselves don't explain why God is doing what he's doing. And I've often said to people that most of Christendom focuses on Jesus's death at Calvary and leaves it there. But I remember when I was first studying the Bible and talking to God, I had a question. And that question was, okay, we know sin is wrong, and we know Adam and Eve sinned. Rather than having Jesus die, why couldn't God have gotten everybody together, said, okay, I understand you guys are sorry for what you did, therefore I forgive you. And people will say, well, it's because you had to pay for your sins. But why? Why couldn't God just forgive us for those sins and, forget about them? The reason is that sin is not something that simply exists in God's mind. Sin is an actual thing. And when someone commits a sin, they introduce a defect into their character and their soul. And it takes a process to remove that defect. So think of it this way. Let's say I had a priceless, incredibly beautiful crystal vase sitting on my table that, cost, the value of it couldn't be calculated. And someone came over my house, knocked that vase on the floor and shattered it. How do you replace something that is irreplaceable? Well, first of all, you've got to cover the cost of it. But even if you could come up with somehow with a pot of money that would cover the cost, the fact is that vase is still in 1,000 pieces. It's broken. So to truly make me whole, you not only have to pay the cost of it, you got to come up with a way to fix it. And that is what the sanctuary service is all about. That is what Jesus is doing in the sanctuary. And the whole point of the sanctuary service was to show us in type how God uses the blood of Jesus to remove the sins that we have committed from our soul and our character to restore us to a state of perfection. So you see, Calvary without the sanctuary is not complete. It's like paying for a vase that's still in 1,000,000 pieces. You got to have a way to fix it. And I don't mean glue it together, but literally remove every fracture, every defect, every missing piece so that it is once again perfect. And that's what the sanctuary is about. And when we look at the sanctuary service, so in ancient Israel, the daily sanctuary service was that people came to the sanctuary, presented their sacrifice, which was a representation of Christ, confessed their sins over it, and their sins were removed from them and transferred to the sanctuary. That was showing us how God is going to use the blood of Christ to remove those sins from our souls. But then there came a point once a year, the Day of Atonement, which means at one minute, the day at which people, the children of God, were brought back into a connection and peace with Him. And that's when the high priest went into the most holy place, standing before the Ark of the Covenant with God's presence hovering above it, again representing when Jesus passed into the most holy place to begin the judgment on the human race. And he would go through each person's case and remove those sins from that person's character, thus recreating them in a perfect condition. But we're told that on the Day of Atonement, the nation of Israel had to fast the entire day. Why was that? It was so that they would have the clearest minds to confess every sin and to, in essence, go through that cleansing ceremony with their high priest, so that when he finished his administration, there was nothing within them left unconfessed, so that all of their sins would be removed. Well, we know now that we are in the true Day of Atonement, that in 1844, Jesus began his ministration in the most holy place. Well, clearly, we cannot fast our entire lives, but we need to have a diet that gives us the clearest mind so that we can be in connection with our high priest as he does his administration for us in the presence of God to remove our sinful natures and bring us into a state of perfection. That's why diet is so important. And very often we may find ourselves struggling with problems we can't seem to get past, habits we can't break. And the question I have to ask, and what we should be asking ourselves is, do I have a clouded mind such that I can't lay hold upon the help that God wants to give me? Is the Holy Spirit trying to tell me something I can't hear because my blood is filled with grease and garbage from eating cheeseburgers and fried chicken and all of this other unhealthy food? We need to clear out that pathway so that God can talk to us. We can hear his voice. As the scripture said, if we do what we're supposed to do, we'll hear that voice saying, nope, don't go that way, go this way, when we would turn to the right or to the left. But if our brain is clouded and we can't hear God's voice, we cannot work with our high priest the way we should be able to. All right. And this is something that really breaks my heart. The fact that people have been so thoroughly brainwashed that they actually think you can eat pieces of dead, rotting corpses, and that somehow that's healthy. The fact is that if you are putting dead things in your mouth, you are putting death in your body. And when animals die, they immediately start to rot and break down and create all sorts of toxic compounds that, when ingested, will cloud our minds, affect our memory, and slowly degrade our body and our brain. And again, I think everybody understands that, let's say you're a baseball pitcher, and your ability to pitch well depends on how healthy your arm is. Well, if I take a baseball pitcher and I take his arm and slam it in the car door, there's no way he's going to be able to pitch a major league game because his arm is damaged and it's inflamed. Well, the same thing is true of our brain. If we continually injure our brain by filling our bloodstream with toxic, unhealthy foods, our brain is going to be inflamed. The blood vessels are going to be clogged up. It's not going to get the nutrients and oxygen it needs, and we're not going to think straight. That's why when people sit down and eat these big unhealthy meals, they oftentimes end up going to sleep or getting really, really irritable. You may or may not have noticed that the Bible likes to tell us very often what people ate before they did something wrong. When the children of Israel were at the foot of Sinai, it says that the children of Israel sat down to eat and drink and rose up to commit sin and create a golden calf. When Balaam came to curse the Israelites, he tried his best to put a curse on them, but as long as they were faithful to God, he couldn't harm them. So what did he do? He sent the Moabites into the camp so that they could have a feast. They started feasting and drinking, and before you know it, they were committing all kinds of sins. And that's why Jesus said, in the last days, it will be as in the days of Noah, where people will be what? Eating and drinking and being profligate sexually and won't even know until the end times are upon them. There's a reason God keeps telling us about eating and drinking, because it is so important to our spiritual health. So today, we're going to talk about, are we designed to eat animals? And this was God's instructions to Adam and Eve after they sinned. So we know that when they were perfect and he put them in the garden, he told them to eat fruit-based diet. The plants of the field were reserved for the animals. But once Adam and Eve sinned and no longer had access to the fruit of the tree of life, God partially replaced the nutrients that they would be missing from that fruit with what is referred to as the plants of the field, which are your vegetables, grains, legumes, which we know have more protein and many of the antioxidants and other phytochemicals that are necessary to preserve our health. But the key thing is that both before and after the fall, God wanted us to be plant-based. And that's what he told us. And if we believe him, as Peter said, we ought to obey God rather than men. So in this lecture, we're going to look at animals that eat plants, animals that eat meat, and then humans to see where we fall on that spectrum. And this is important because, as this slide shows, experts estimate that up to 80% of the diseases and premature death that we see in this country could be prevented by making major changes in our diet and lifestyle. So let's look at body plans, how animals are constructed. And the first thing I want to talk about is the energy efficiency of how these animals eat. And that's important because animals that eat plants like these are eating things that are stuck in the ground. They don't get up and run away when you come to eat them. But they tend to be spread out over a wide area, and they're only available when the rainy season comes about. Therefore, animals that eat plants have to be able to cover large amounts of area at a very low energy cost. Because obviously, if you expend more energy looking for and getting the food that you eat, then you can extract from that food, you're going to starve to death. Well, animals that eat other animals have a very different problem. And it's because animals don't want to be eaten. Therefore, when people when these carnivores try to eat them, these animals tend to run away. Or they fight back and try to stab you with their horns or kick you with their feet. So animals that are designed to eat other animals are designed as predators. They have weapons. They can run very fast so they can chase down their prey items, and then they have the tools to kill them and then rip them apart so they can ingest them. And again, they have to do that in a way that they expend less energy chasing and getting the animal than they do that they receive more energy from eating the animal than they expended chasing that animal. So carnivores are designed for predation. Plant eaters are designed for foraging. As we said, all animals have to procure their food in an energy efficient fashion. So what that means is that carnivorous animals do not go out and look for the biggest, strongest, healthiest animal in nature. And the reason is that that big, healthy elk or deer is likely to either outrun them or hurt them and even kill them if they try to bring it down. So instead, they look for animals that are limping, that are filled with disease, that are injured, that are very old, because those animals are easier to catch. Or in many cases, they look for something that's already dead, because they can still extract energy from that animal, but they expend much less energy capturing it, and therefore their energy balance is in a positive note. The plant eaters, by contrast, don't want vegetation that's all dried and wasted and blasted, and because that plant food is less nutritious. Therefore, herbivores spend their time looking for fresh, lush, verdant plants because these plants are healthy and are the most nutritious. One of the problems with human beings eating meat is that we have the mindset of a plant eater. We don't like food that looks like it's rotting or falling apart or defective. We want the best, the biggest, the most beautiful. Well, when carnivores eat weak, diseased, and defective animals, they actually strengthen the gene pool of the animals that they're preying on because they weed out the bad genes. When plant eaters eat the healthiest plants, they actually help those plants because the seeds of those plants pass through the digestive tract and are deposited somewhere in a different area with a little bit of fertilizer, and they help spread those plants. But when you start to prey on other animals and you actually kill and remove the healthiest, strongest of those animals, you end up driving those species to extinction. And that brings up this concept of the beauty paradigm and species destruction. So as we said already, survival is energy out versus energy in. If you expend more energy that you can get from the food that you acquire, you will starve to death. For that reason, all true predator species do seek what can be thought of as ugly food. They don't waste their time and energy pursuing the strongest and healthiest animals because they will likely be unsuccessful. So they, again, prey on the defective ones, the old, the sick, the lame, or the ones that are just stupid, or something that's already dead. And when they do this, they strengthen the gene pool of those animals. As you said, herbivores seek what can be thought of as beautiful food, the luscious, most fresh and robust plants, because that's the most nutritious. But again, when we take our mindset and prey on animals, we end up knocking nature out of balance and driving these animals to extinction. So let's look at carnivores. Well, one of the first things you notice is that they have a very streamlined shape. They are designed to run fast. They present the smallest cross-section of their body to the wind when they're running. They have what can be thought of as an armored front, meaning that you can see they have heavily padded neck and shoulders. Their internal organs are enclosed by their rib cage. The most vulnerable parts of these animals are all the way at the back, meaning the abdomen and the gonads, so that if an animal tries to kick them as they're chasing it, they're unlikely to be injured. They have a thick, sturdy neck, forward deployed weapons, which if you've looked into the face of a snarling dog, you know what I mean. Their teeth, their claws. Their top speed tends to be 35 to 40 miles an hour. Now, why is that important? Because that's important. That means that they're fast enough to chase and capture an animal that's injured or sick, but they really are not fast enough to chase down an antelope or a deer or a wildebeest that's in the prime of its life, because those animals are always just a little faster. So that ensures they'll weed out the sick ones, the defective ones, but not the healthy ones. They have what's called a digitigrade stance, and I'll show you an example of that. But what it means is that they're permanently on their toes. Now, when you watch things like the Olympics or other track and field meets, you notice that for humans, because we're flat-foot, when we get ready to run, what do they say? Runners, on your mark, get ready. And then that's when everyone lifts up onto their toes, and then they start running. Well, these animals are always on their toes. And you'll see that when I show you a picture of a skeleton. So they are permanently ready to run. And whereas we have to get down in a crouch so that we can spring forward and run fast, they have permanently flexed joints so that they are always ready to run. And standing on their toes also means that their legs are longer, and that increases their stride length and helps them run faster. Their nails are sharp claws and act like sprinter spikes, spikes, and help them to grab the ground, but it also helps them to grab onto and grapple with prey and wound the prey. As I said, they have permanently flexed joints, which facilitates their rapid acceleration for pursuing animals. But what that means is that because their joints are flexed, whenever they're standing up, their muscles are resisting gravity, not their skeleton. And that means it costs them a lot of energy to stand, which is why if they're not actively moving somewhere or chasing something, carnivores always lay down because it allows them to save energy. They have lightened legs. You can see their limbs are fairly thin, and the size of their feet have been reduced. They've got very small toes, and in some cases have lost a few toes. And that means that, again, that reduces the energy cost of running because their legs are lighter, their feet are smaller, and that allows them to run faster. Their senses are attuned to finding animals to eat. So they have super acute hearing. Their ears swivel like little radar dishes, which helps them localize prey. Their eyes are optimized for night vision, not daytime vision, but night vision. Carnivores see up to 6 times better at night than we do. And they, in essence, have their own built-in night vision goggles. And their retinas are actually geared towards detecting movement. And the reason is because if something is moving, that usually means it's alive and it can be eaten. But they have very low resolution. They don't see detail very well. And they don't have color vision because color vision is not necessary for chasing down other animals. Color vision is only important if you need to know whether plants are ready to be eaten. Their sense of smell can be as much as 100,000 times more powerful than ours. And it's sensitive enough for them to not only detect and track prey, but very importantly, it also allows them to figure out which animals in the herd are sick. And we, in the medicine field, have started to use this ability by training companion animals to be able to sniff when someone is about to have a seizure, or they can actually detect when a diabetic's blood sugar level is going too low. And we're training dogs to smell cancer recurrence in cancer survivors even before we can find it on something like a CAT scan or MRI. So the point that I'm making is, remember that whole point about expending less energy. These animals are not going out hunting randomly. They are literally going out, sniffing out which animals are sick, because those animals are going to be easier to catch. Now, this is that picture of the carnivore skeleton that I told you about. You can see they're on their toes. The heel on a carnivore is up to 1/3 of the way up their leg. So they're always ready to run, unlike us. And as you can see, their joints are flexed. So again, they're ready to develop that burst of speed. Now let's look at the plant eaters. I've divided them into 2 categories, what I call vulnerable herbivores, those that tend to be preyed upon by carnivores. And then we'll look at the larger plant eaters that are so big and massive that essentially nothing messes with them. But we see that they have very straight limbs, which means that they are designed for covering large amounts of territory at a very low energy cost. They tend to remain active throughout the day, whereas carnivores tend to be more active at night. I find it interesting that people often complain that their cats and dogs become very lively and active at nighttime, but that's what they normally do because that's when they normally hunt. And why would they do that? Because animals are usually asleep. So that makes them what? Easier to catch. The plant eaters often live in large multifamily social groups. We can see their limbs are straight so that it's their skeleton that's resisting gravity, not their muscles. Some of them are so well designed, like horses, that they can sleep standing up. They just lock their legs in place and remain and go to sleep. And their limbs are even skinnier and of a lighter weight than the meat eaters, which means that they can run faster at lower energy costs. But they did something else. They are called ungulates because they have what's called an unguligrade stance, which means that they are literally standing on the tips of their toes like a ballerina. And here's a picture of that. So this is how these animals are standing. So when you look at the ungulates, the two-toed and three-toed, and in the case of the horse, one toe, they are literally on the tips of their toes, which makes their legs even longer, which means their stride length is longer. And in many cases, instead of just reducing the size of their toes, they've actually jettisoned many of their toes so that they're down to 3, 2, and in the case of the horse family, 1 toe. And again, that allows them to not only run faster, but it gives them greater endurance. Their nails, instead of being sharp claws, are flat and blunt. Many plant eaters have color vision because they have to be able to detect when fruit or grasses are ripe, and they're usually active in the daytime, and their top speed, it can be 45 to 50 miles an hour, which means that if they are healthy, they can typically outrun the average carnivore. Then when we look at the invulnerable herbivores like the elephants, they're so big and powerful, they're essentially immune to being preyed upon. So they don't need skinny little legs to help them run because they don't have to run from anybody. Therefore, their top speed is only about 25 to 30 miles an hour max. They too are daytime foragers, but they have these heavy, thick, pillar-like limbs that help them stand up at low energy costs, have a hairless skin. Their nails are also flat and blunt, and they have large, heavy, flat-like feet, which is called a plantigrade stance. Like humans, elephants are long-lived social mammals that live in family groups of various sizes. And we find that the plant-eating mammals tend to live much longer than those that eat meat. They are a living testament to the adequacy of plant protein, and all protein is made by plants. And let me just say, I have a lecture on YouTube under Dr. McMills on protein that explains all of this in great detail. So any protein people find in animal tissue is actually recycled or secondhand plant protein. So this is a picture of an elephant and a cat's skeleton drawn to scale, so you can look at the differences in the limbs. You see the elephant has very straight limbs, whereas the cat has this bent structure or flex limb structure, which allows it to run fast. Elephants don't have to run fast, so they don't need that. When you look at the energy cost of locomotion, meaning how much energy you expend to move, what's interesting is that for every animal other than humans, the faster they walk, the more energy they burn. Humans are different because over a wide range of speeds, we use less energy to walk than would be predicted for an animal our size. And that's why instead of a straight line, we get a bent curve or parabola. And that area within that parabola represents the energy savings. And the reason we are able to do that is because of the way God designed us, standing upright. Because that means that every time you take a step and your leg swings forward, your center of mass actually falls outside of your body, which means you actually start to fall. But because your leg is outstretched and planted, you essentially plant yourself and vault over that leg and repeat the process. And again, the way we walk is done so well that it looks really smooth, but you can tell that we're actually falling forward if you stub your toe, because anything that slightly prevents your leg from being in the right place at the right time causes you to almost fall on your face. And so it's because of the way that we stand, gravity actually helps us walk and reduces the energy cost of walking, which means that we are in some senses the ultimate foragers because we can walk around at a very low energy cost. Then when you look at the human body plan, you can see that we're designed for walking while foraging. We are lousy runners for a variety of reasons. One, when we run, we present the widest cross-section to the wind, unlike animals designed for speed. We have a very unprotected, exposed anatomy. Our abdomen and gonads are right up front, and if you've ever been kicked on them, you know what I'm talking about. We have a flattened, non-aerodynamic body, and we have these very thick, heavy legs, which again, work really well for walking because they swing like pendulums and require very little energy to walk. But when we try to run, we now have to really pick up these very heavy legs, these very big feet, and that requires a lot of energy, which is why humans don't run very fast, nor do we tend to have very good stamina when we're running at top speed. We have very large, heavy feet, but we do have the typical hairless skin. Our nails are flat and blunt, and it's the lifestyle factors of human populations that make us relatively invulnerable to predation, meaning that we are active during the daytime when most carnivores are asleep. We tend to hang together in large groups, which again allows us to have collective defense. And when the carnivores come out and start hunting, if we have any sense, we are at home in bed. And I argue that our slow speed and poor endurance is really most useful for escaping stinging insects. Well, why do I say that? The very fastest humans in the world, both men and women, run at top speed at a speed of about 21 to 24 miles an hour, max. And from watching the Olympics, you know that humans can only keep up that speed for a little less than 200 meters. When you watch the 200 meters, by the 2/3 point, all of the runners are slowing down. And the one who wins is just the one who was fastest at the beginning. Well, when you look at bees and wasps, we find that bees and wasps fly at about 20 miles an hour. And they typically will only chase an intruder or a perceived threat for a 200-meter circle around their hive or base. So clearly, we can run fast enough to run away from some bees that we might encounter when we're out looking for fruit, but we do not run fast enough to chase down any healthy animal, nor are we fast enough to escape from an animal like, you know, a pack of wolves or a lion or a tiger or a bear. And then the absurdity of hunting for humans is really brought into focus when you look at pregnant women, because clearly, one, the lower upper body strength of women and the long gestation period of human babies, and the fact that a woman in an advanced state of pregnancy clearly can't go out and grapple with any kind of animal because she would most likely kill both herself and her baby. Now, the way human anthropologists have dealt with that is that they said, well, you know, the women stayed home while the men went out to hunt, which is ridiculous. The female of every species is always able to procure the diet she needs to live, eat, and raise her young. There is no situation in nature where the female of the species cannot procure the diet she needs. And what we will see in a minute is that the long gestation period and the number of babies that humans have on average is really typical of large plant eaters. And you could even argue that human fetal brain development means that you had to be an herbivore to be a human, for the human brain to develop, because the human brain doesn't even begin to really develop until after the first trimester. Most carnivores, again, as you will see, are born well before that time. And with humans, as with most large herbivores, single births are the rule. and that we have relatively large babies that weigh 6 to 8% of mother's ideal body weight. And when our babies are born, they have very advanced neural development, which is why they're born with their eyes open. So let's look at length of gestation in weeks for meat eaters versus plant eaters. What you see up top is that all of the plant eaters have, all of the meat eaters have very short gestation periods. Their babies are born at a very premature state. And that's because, again, a heavily pregnant female animal cannot be out chasing something down, wrestling with an animal, and trying to kill and dismember it, because they would kill themselves and their baby. Whereas you look at the plant eaters, they all have very long gestations of 36 weeks or more. And humans at the bottom are right within that category. Also, they typically have either single births or twins at the most. And again, that is what we see in human beings. Well, let's look at birth weight. Here again, stark differences. All of the carnivores have tiny little immature babies. When their babies are born, their eyes are closed because their brains are still developing, whereas all of the plant eaters have large babies relative to the mother's size. So these numbers represent the percentage of the baby's body weight relative to the mother's body weight. And again, it averages from 5 up to a high of 11%, but clearly humans are right in the same category. And what that means is that for plant eaters, the mother invests a lot more energy into each individual babies instead of having litters of animals that are expendable in essence. And then a word about milk, because people in Western countries have been brainwashed into thinking that we're supposed to be drinking the milk from another species. What I want you to take from this chart is the realization that milks are designed for specific species. And each individual animal's milk is really meant for that animal, not for some other animal. One of the things that you notice right off the top is that when you look at the meat eaters at the top, they all have a lot more fat and a lot more protein in their milk than the two plant eaters at the bottom. You see that? And that's because, again, their babies essentially continue their development outside the womb. And they're growing at a very fast rate, which means they need a lot more energy and they need a lot more protein, because proteins are building blocks. If you notice from this chart, human beings have the lowest protein percentage of any species on Earth. But why is that? It's because we are the slowest growing species on Earth. No other species takes 20 years to reach maturity the way humans do. Now let's focus at the bottom on both on the cows and cows and humans. So we got two plant-eating species. When you look at the total amount of solids, it's essentially the same. Interestingly, when you look at the percentage of fat in cow's milk versus human milk, it's about the same. You got 3.6 versus 3.7. That's essentially exactly the same. But the important thing to note, to realize, is that the type of fat is very different. I'm sure all of you have seen human breast milk. It has a thin, almost translucent quality about it, whereas whole cow's milk is opaque and creamy white. And that's because the fat that's in cow's milk is much more saturated than the fat that's in human breast milk. And that's why you can take cow's milk and churn it and get butter out of it, or freeze it and make ice cream. You can churn human milk all day long and you're never gonna get any butter out of it, okay? Because there's not, the fat that's in human milk is unsaturated fat. Now let's look at the protein. Again, when you look at the protein content of cow's milk relative to humans, cows have 2.5 to almost 3 times as much protein in their milk as opposed to human milk. Why is that? That's because a baby calf will reach maturity in 2 to 3 years. They are growing at a much faster rate than human babies. Therefore, they need more protein, and those proteins are different. But look at the amount of sugar, which is the lactose. Human milk, even now, a baby calf at birth weighs somewhere between 60 to 80 pounds. A human baby weighs about 8 pounds on average. But look at the amount of sugar that's in the milk. There is 1.5 times as much sugar in human milk as in cow's milk. Why is that? It's because the human baby's brain is so much bigger in proportion to its overall size than a cow's brain or any of these other animals. And the brain uses nothing but sugar for its metabolism. That's why human breast milk has so much more sugar in it. And that also means that if any person is feeding their baby cow's milk, you are relatively starving their brain because there's not enough energy or not as much energy in that cow's milk as there should be. All right. We've covered this. And let's talk about some health problems associated with cow's milk. We know that cow's milk potentiates and can exacerbate asthma in children. And that's because it stimulates the body to make a lot of mucus, which clogs up the respiratory tree. It is also associated with sinusitis for many of the same reasons, excess mucus production. Early exposure to cow's milk can actually cause children to develop type 1 diabetes. Studies have shown that kids who drink cow's milk because of all the inflammatory compounds in it have a much worse problem with acne. In small children, they can actually have an allergic response to the proteins in the cow's milk that can cause rashes, constipation, and other types of gastrointestinal distress. So it's not a good idea to feed your kids cow's milk. Well, some people say, well, wait a minute, what about the nutrients that are in cow's milk? Well, let's talk about that. Well, one of the major ones is what's called 1,25-dihydroxycalciferol, or D3. It's commonly thought of as vitamin D, but D3 is not a vitamin, it's a hormone. And if we as humans were running around naked in the sun as God intended, we would make all of the D3 that we need. But because living in Western countries and living in these northern environments, we tend to wear clothes all day. And even when we're outside, we're not outside for that long. We tend to spend much of our time inside. We don't make as much of the D3 as we should. And that's why we should take a supplement. But the dairy industry, back in the early part of the 20th century, realized that if they added D3 to their products and called it vitamin D, that would entice people to purchase their products. So the first thing for you to realize is that, number one, it's a hormone. It's a hormone we make when we are exposed to the sun. But for most of us, particularly darker skinned people, we simply are not out in the sun enough to make adequate amounts. Let me say, by the way, that many researchers now believe that the reason colds and flu decrease in the spring and summer and spike in the wintertime is because people are out in the sun and outside more, and their D levels go up through sun exposure. But during the winter, when they're covered up and closed and indoors, the D levels fall, and that makes you much more vulnerable to viral infections because our immune cells need this D3 in order to work. And let me just say, to be topical, that there are many studies that are coming out now showing that when people have low D levels, they are much more susceptible to getting coronavirus infection or having a more severe course. So it is critically important to keep your D levels elevated and replete to ward off all viral infections, especially coronavirus. There's phosphorus. Yes, there's phosphorus in D. There's a little bit, much more in plant foods. Plenty of magnesium in plant foods, and most dairy calcium is not a good way to get your calcium, because people say, well, there's calcium in milk. Where did it come from? Was the mother cow drinking milk? No, she was eating green leafy vegetables. There's plenty of calcium in your green leafy vegetables, in your legumes, and even nuts. You do not need dairy for calcium. Plenty of zinc in plant foods, and animal protein causes cancer in humans. So I tell people that drinking milk for nutrients is like inhaling cigarette smoke because it has oxygen in it. It's not a good idea. So moving on to the head and neck region, when you look at the meat eaters, you see that they have very reduced facial muscles, and that allows them to open their mouth very wide so they can run up and grab onto an animal and start to dismember it. The most important muscle for operating their lower jaw is the temporalis muscle, which sits on the top of the head. Their teeth are not designed for chewing. They're designed for ripping, tearing, and cutting, because carnivores don't chew their food. They simply saw off a massive piece of flesh, swallow it whole, and let their digestive enzymes do the work. So their jaw is very stable, which it has to be if they're going to use it to kill, to grab, kill, and dismember an animal. And there are no enzymes in their saliva. And this is a picture of a carnivore skeleton. And what you see is that big empty hole at the top of the skull. That's where the temporalis muscle sits. The other muscles that operate the jaw are the masseter and pterygoids, which have next to no function in these animals. But the other thing I want you to see is that the jaw joint is on the same plane as the cheek teeth, which allows the jaw to act like a pair of shears. You see that the flat blade-like molars in the upper jaw slide completely past the blade-like molars in the lower jaw, which allows these animals to shear flesh off bone and cut through bones and hides and so forth. So their jaws are literally designed like shears. And the area called the angle of the mandible, which is where the masseter and pterygoid muscles attach, is almost non-existent in these animals because those muscles don't do very much for them. And when you look at how strong their jaws are, they have very powerful jaws so that they can, again, dismember these animals. Dogs can do up to 450 pounds per square inch. Wolves are over 500 pounds per square inch. Jaguars, 700 PSI. Lions and tigers can get up to 900 PSI. Hyenas can generate over 1,000 pounds per square inch. By contrast, the best we can do is about 150 pounds per square inch, which helps you crack open a walnut, but not a Brazil nut. So what about the herbivores? Well, very big differences. Herbivores have very well-developed facial muscles and a very small opening into the oral cavity that they usually have very muscular lips that helps them move food into the mouth. The area called the angle of the mandible is expanded, which is where the masseter and pterygoids attach, and I'll show you that in a minute. And very importantly, the jaw joint has moved to a position above the cheek teeth, which gives the lower jaw an L-type shape, meaning that when the jaw closes, instead of the teeth sliding past each other, they come down on top of each other. And they form these very long, extended grinding platforms. Excuse me. And this type of jaw joint is very mobile, which allows them to chew and crush and grind up their food. But it also means that because it's so loose, it can be easily dislocated. So an animal that has a jaw like this clearly has committed to a plant-based diet. And again, people who believe in evolution think that this jaw has evolved independently more than 15 times. But we see that the teeth are designed for cropping off plant foods, crushing and grinding those foods up. And the reason is plant tissues have fiber in it. We'll talk about that a little bit more later. And so to get at the nutrients, you got to disrupt those plant cells so you can extract the nutrients out of them. You can see the area at the angle of the mandible is expanded so that there's broad area for attachment of the masseter and pterygoid muscles. The lower jaw has pronounced side-to-side movement, can move backwards and forwards, and those are all the movements of chewing. The saliva in plant-based animals also has enzymes in it, like salivary amylase, that begin to actually break down carbohydrate as the animals are chewing. When you look at the differences in teeth, again, in the carnivores, they're these blade-like teeth. They're flattened and shaped like little serrated steak knives, whereas in the plant eaters, they're flat and nodular for grinding. And you see the motions of the jaw. In the carnivores, the teeth slide past each other in a vertical plane, whereas in the herbivores, the plant eaters, the teeth slide across each other in a horizontal plane. Completely different jaw mechanisms. And interestingly, because the herbivores, the plant eaters, have these well-developed facial muscles and a small opening into their oral cavity, they can generate a vacuum, which means that when they drink water, they can suck up water. They just kind of create that space and the water flows in. The carnivores can't create a vacuum, so they all have to lap up their water. So the fact that you can use a straw is because you are an herbivore. When you look at the esophagus, which is a tube that leads from the mouth down to the stomach, in the meat eaters, we see that it is wide and very stretchy. That allows them to swallow these big, huge chunks of flesh and bone and hide without choking to death. They also have voluntary muscle along the entire length, which means that they can regurgitate food at will. And that's important because that's how they feed their babies. They will go and consume a stomach full of meat and then come back to the den and regurgitate some of that meat for their young. When we look at the plant eaters, very different. The esophagus is a narrow muscular tube, which means that in order for them to get something down their esophagus, they have to chew it thoroughly so that it's soft and small and will flow down the esophagus very easily. All right, looking at the gastrointestinal tract, again, just to make some important points, animal tissue, animal cells have a membrane made up of fatty molecules. Inside that cell, there's protein, some water, some fat, but there's absolutely no fiber. So animal tissue is actually very easily broken down and digested. And therefore, meat eaters do not require a long or elaborate gastrointestinal tract. But let's talk about their stomach. Now, when you observe meat eaters in nature, what we find is that they typically are unsuccessful most of the time they go out to hunt. 70 to 90% of the time a carnivore goes out to chase down an animal and kill it, they don't catch it. So I have to ask, if somebody snatched your food from you 80 to 90% of the times you sat down to eat, how on earth could you avoid starving to death? If these animals are unsuccessful 80 to 90% of the time they go out to get a meal, how is it that they can still live, survive, and prosper? Well, it's because they have gigantic stomachs. And we also know that they will make a kill and they will protect that. If it's a large animal, like a leopard will drag it up a tree so that nothing else can get to it, or tigers and jaguars and lions will often cover it up with brush and dirt and debris and then come back and feed on it until the carcass is gone, meaning that they are eating dead, rotting tissue. How can they do that without dying? It's because their stomachs have extremely powerful acid in it. When a carnivore's stomach is full of food, they secrete enough acid to get the pH of that stomach down to less than 1. That is literally stronger than battery acid. And so that means that that acid will dissolve bones, it'll dissolve hooves, hide, and kill off any bacteria in that food. And again, their stomachs are huge. They allow these animals to consume up to 30% of their body weight at one meal. That's how they avoid starving to death. So that means a 300-pound lioness can literally eat 100 pounds of flesh at one meal. That's enough food for her to recover all of the energy she wasted chasing things she didn't catch and still have enough energy left for her until she can make another kill. So we see that the stomachs of carnivores are designed for intermittent feeding. They may eat today and not eat for another 7 to 10 days, but they can eat so much at a single meal that they can still consume enough calories to keep themselves alive. And this just points that out, that they need these giant stomachs because hunting is so inefficient. And it means if you look at a wolf that weighs 110 pounds, that wolf can eat 34 pounds of meat at a single meal. Ain't no human being can do that. And that means that they can ingest up to 21,000 calories or more at a single meal. And again, if we tried to do that, we would poison ourselves because our livers would shut down. And so that means that they can consume enough at a single meal to recover all of the energy they wasted during unsuccessful hunts and still have enough to last them until they make another kill. And the fact that they can eat dead, putrefying flesh means they can extract even more energy off that carcass if they can keep other animals from stealing it from them. When you look at their small intestine, again, because meat is so easily broken down, they have very short small intestines. Their small intestine is usually only about 3 to 4 times their body length. It is lined with protein and fat digesting enzymes. They can go long periods between meals without losing the ability to absorb food, but they do have a limited ability to absorb carbohydrates. And if you feed too many carbohydrates to a meat eater, it'll give them diarrhea and make them sick. So these are just some pictures of various carnivore digestive tracts. You see giant stomach, short, small intestine, and even the colon is short, straight, and smooth because not a lot goes on in these animals. Well, again, when you look at plant foods, very different issue. Why? Because plants don't have bones. They have to use fiber to stiffen and protect their tissues. And so that means that every plant cell, in addition to having a cell membrane, has a cell wall that is made up of cellulose or undigestible fiber. And that means that in order for an herbivore to get the nutrients that are contained in these plant foods, they literally have to disrupt or tear apart that cell structure. And that's what chewing is for, to disrupt the cell structure within these plant foods so that the animal digestive enzymes can extract all of the good stuff that is inside. And because of the presence of the fiber, that means plant eaters have to have a much longer and more elaborate digestive tract. Now, we see two major schemes in the plant eaters. They're down at the bottom, you see what are called the ruminants. These are animals that eat a diet that is made up of essentially all fiber. They eat grass, hay, leaves, things like that. And mammals do not make enzymes that break down cellulose or plant fiber, but bacteria do. And so that's why in this first stomach, in the cows and other ruminants, there's this soup made up of bacteria and protozoa that release enzymes that will break down cellulose. And what will happen is a cow or an antelope will go and scoop up a stomach full of grass and swallow it, let the grass soak up those enzymes, then they bring it back up and chew it to mix those enzymes with that plant material so that the process of digestion can start. And when they swallow it again, it goes into a separate stomach where that a reaction proceeds apace. We're going to really ignore those animals because we clearly aren't designed to eat hay, grass, and leaves. But I just wanted to point out that not all herbivores or plant eaters have the multiple stomachs. And you can really tell the difference very easily between what type of animal you're looking at by looking at their stools. Ruminants, because that process of foregut fermentation is very efficient, pass a liquid stool. Whereas when you look at animals like horses and rabbits and the great apes and even elephants, they tend to eat food that has a lot more nutrient value. So they eat grains and roots and fruits. And it is not only inefficient for ruminants to eat that kind of food, it makes them sick because the bacteria start using all that available energy and they overpopulate and they cause the animals to become sick. Whereas in the single stomach herbivores, they eat food that has a high nutrient content. The stomach liquefies that food. It passes through the small intestine where they extract the readily absorbable nutrients. Then the leftover fiber goes into the colon, where there's a population of bacteria that further breaks down that fiber and they extract additional nutrients from it. And what you see is that they tend to pass a more fibrous and solid stool. And clearly, we take after the horses more than we do the ruminants. So when looking at those plant eaters with a simple stomach, they have relatively small stomachs. They only hold about 30% of the total gut capacity. Herbivores, on average, eat about 3.3% of their body weight per day. When their stomach has food in it, the pH tends to be about 4.5 to 5, so it's only moderately acidic, which is, again, acid enough to kill the type of bacteria that tend to cling to plant tissues, but it will not kill the pathogenic bacteria you find in rotting flesh, which is why human beings get food poisoning so easily. And the important point is that in the plant eaters, the stomachs are designed for batch feeding, meaning that one stomach full of food does not contain enough energy to get that animal through a single day. So they have to eat multiple times every day to get enough energy. And that's a major difference. Carnivore, they can eat once a week or once every 10 days, and they're fine. The herbivores have to eat multiple times every day to get enough calories to get them through the day. And because of the presence of the fiber, it takes longer to extract the nutrients. So herbivores have much longer small intestines. The small intestine in a plant-eating mammal tends to be 10 to 12 times body length or more. And again, that's because the fiber slows down the digestion. They have an adjustable mix of enzymes and an unlimited capacity to absorb carbohydrate. And so here's some pictures. In the middle is a dik-dik, which is a ruminant with the multiple stomachs. But on either end, you see rabbit and a zebra, simple stomach, very long small intestine, but also a long, large, pouched, structured large intestine as well. And just to kind of reiterate, in the carnivores, the colon, very short, straight and smooth. And the reason is that by the time any residue from a meal gets to the colon, it has no more nutrient value. Protein residues can only rot. They can't be fermented. Therefore, these animals want to eliminate the meal residue as quickly as possible before it starts to putrefy and release toxins. But because the plant eaters still have a lot of fiber in that leftover meal, they have a population of bacteria in their colons that breaks down that fiber into a number of beneficial compounds and into energy generating compounds. And so they have much longer, much more capacious large intestines. That's why it has that pouch structure, so it can stretch out and distend when that fiber load comes down. And they ferment the fiber, they absorb water, they produce vitamins, and the compounds that are produced in the large intestine in herbivores actually enhance their immune systems and help them ward off not only infections, but also cancers and other diseases. So let's look at humans. And just to make an important point, humans have the palate, preferences, and psychology of a plant eater. We naturally love and crave the textures, tastes, colors, and variety of plant foods. And this is a Far Side cartoon. It says Rusty makes his move. He's spraying a can of dog breath to attract his mate. And we know that carnivores will often go out if they find a rotting carcass and they roll in that carcass, because that makes them more desirable to their pack mates. Why? Because if they smell like something dead, that is in essence saying, hey, I know where food is. So that brings the question up, if we're natural meat eaters, why don't we go over a date's door wearing scraps of meat and smelling like putrid flesh rather than flowers and fruit? It's because we don't want the putrid flesh. We want to smell like flowers and fruit because our brain is telling us that's what we should be eating. And that's why we expend all of this time and energy creating all of these scented products in our homes, because it's telling our brains that we're living in a healthier environment if we are surrounded by things that smell like plants and fruits. And then this brings up the fact that we disguise animal flesh to make it more attractive to us. We try to make it look like edible plant parts. So watch this little video. You see what we're doing? We're taking this animal flesh and we're carving it up and shaping it so that it mimics edible plant parts and fools our brains into thinking this is something we should be eating. And then we cover it up with what? Seasonings, which are all plants, to try and make it taste like plant foods. And even when people eat raw fish, they carve it up so that it actually looks like pieces of fruit. And that's what makes it more acceptable to our brain. So when you look at human teeth, clearly we have flat, broad incisors that are useful for peeling fruit, cropping off plant tissues so that we can chew them. The human canines have become small, rounded, and reduced in size so that they really function like incisors and not at all like canine teeth. The human jaw joint is clearly at a position above the plane of the cheek teeth, and when our jaws close, the teeth come together on top of each other to form these extended grinding platforms. Can you all see what I'm doing right now? I want you to do what I'm doing and bite down, okay? Kathy, thank you. All right, you feel that muscle popping out? Bite. No, put it back here and bite down. That's your masseter, okay? That's the muscle that attaches to that expanded angle of the mandible. And on the inside, as I'll show you in a minute, is another set of muscles called the pterygoids, and they hold the lower jaw in a sling-like arrangement, which allows it to swing backwards and forwards, and side to side, and also backwards and forwards, and that gives us those rotary actions of chewing. This is a comparison between various animals. We got a horse, a human, and a wolf. Clearly, our jaw is built like that of the horse. We have teeth like a horse, and you notice that even horses have small canines. So the presence of canines does not mean you were meant to eat meat at all. We can see very well that our jaws are not built anything like those of your classic meat eater. Humans clearly have a walled-in, well-developed facial muscles, which we use to express emotion, but also, importantly, to chew our food. We have fleshy, muscular lips, which helps us move food into our oral cavity for chewing. The fact that we can use them for kissing is a fringe benefit. And the temporalis muscle, which sits on the top of our head, is almost vestigial. When you look on the inside, this is where you can see those pterygoid muscles, which oppose the masseter muscle that I was telling you about. We have an enzyme in our saliva that's made by the parotid gland, which actually sits right in front of our ear. And that enzyme, salivary amylase, actually begins the process of digesting carbohydrates while we're chewing our food. Our tongue is very thick and muscular, aids in moving food around our mouth. Because of the structure of our pharynx, it allows us to actually have speech. In humans, the esophagus is narrow and muscular. It can only handle a small bolus of thoroughly chewed food. Over 90% of the people who choke to death every year choke to death eating meat. And that's because our esophagus is not meant to handle it. Moreover, the number one culprit, interestingly, is our hot dogs. And gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD, which is severe intractable heartburn, is due to eating a diet that's high in animal fat and animal tissue. And if GERD goes untreated, it can cause the esophagus to become cancerous. And one method for getting rid of GERD is to become entirely plant-based. Human stomach, typical for a plant eater. When we have food in our stomach, the pH is around 4.5, holds only about 25% of our GI capacity. As you know, it's designed for batch feeding, and humans eat typically 2 to 3 meals a day. And if you look at the average amount of food that a human eats on a daily basis, it's about 4.5 to 5.4 pounds of food, and that's classically about 3.3% of our body weight, which again is typical for plant eaters. And so because of the small capacity of our stomach and the fact that we cannot eat rotting tissue, clearly we are not meant to be eating meat. And that's why hunting is not nearly as beneficial to us as it is to true meat eaters. And so in the absence of refrigerators or living in a place like the Arctic, hunting is simply not an efficient way for human beings to obtain food. And that's why whenever locusts came around, instead of saying, oh, look, yummy, something to eat, we realized that if they ate up all of our plants, we were likely going to starve to death. Now, this graph shows the gastrointestinal or small intestinal absorptive area versus body size for the animals that are like the ruminants or the folivores, the animals that are fruit eaters versus the animals that are meat eaters. And what you see is that the animals with the least amount of absorptive area are, as we already discussed, the meat eaters. The animals with the largest amount of absorptive area are those that are designed to eat leaves and hay and grass. And right in the middle are the fruit eaters. And so if you graph out human body size to our absorptive area, we fall squarely on the graph for fruit eaters or frugivores, which is exactly what the Bible tells us. And the human small intestine is typically about 30 to 35 feet long, maybe a little shorter in really small individuals. But if you take a 6-foot man, he's going to have about 35 feet of small intestine. Well, again, I said that the small intestine in plant eaters was 10 to 12 times body length. If you say, well, wait a minute, if a 6-foot man has a 30-foot small intestine, that's only 6 times body length. No, body length is not measured head to toe, it's measured head to tailbone. And the typical length of a human torso is about 2.5 to 3 feet. So again, we have the classic proportions of your typical plant eater. And the area in our small intestine is further increased because the mucosa are thrown up into these finger-like projections called villi. And then if you look at the villi, on their surface, there's even further subdivisions called microvilli. And the total surface area inside your small intestine is equal to a singles tennis court. That's how much absorptive area you have inside. And that's a huge amount of area, but we need that because we should be eating plants, which require much more time. Now, there's what I call phase 2 digestion, and that's what happens in the colon. And you hear all of this nonsense amongst these so-called paleo people talking about eating a high fat or a high meat diet. That is foolishness and nonsense. when we look at the evidence from what people in pre-industrialized societies were eating, it's clear they were eating fiber. Basically, this is fossilized human poop. Okay, that's what that is. That's something that a human from thousands of years ago passed, and it became fossilized, and it's nothing but plant fiber. Okay, so clearly from day one, we were eating a high fiber diet, and that's what we should be eating even today. And so this is from a book called Topics in Dietary Fiber Research. This is the role of dietary fiber in pre-agricultural subsistence economy of early human population strongly suggests that for over 99% of our existence, we were eating a diet that was very high in coarse plant fiber. And when you look at our colon for animal our size, it's very long, has that typical pouched structure found in the plant eaters. And interestingly, it has an appendix, and an appendix is only found in plant eaters. And the primary functions, of course, it absorbs water, breaks down plant fibers into these short-chain fatty acids, and also produces vitamins before finally we eliminate what's left over. And it turns out that a meal spends more time in the colon than it does the stomach and small intestine. A typical meal takes about 14 hours to pass through our digestive tract. And it only spends about 2 hours in the stomach. It spends less than 2 hours in the passing through the small intestine. The rest of that time, it's in the colon. And the reason is that it takes time for those bacteria to act on that plant fiber. But if we're not eating enough plant fiber, then that's where we get into problems. Low fiber diets cause a number of serious health problems, including diverticulosis, diverticulitis, colon cancer, and a host of other health problems. So what are some of the benefits of fiber fermentation? Well, first of all, there are 2 types of fiber, but many varieties. So this first graph or chart shows you what are called the water-soluble types of fiber. And that can be found, and they are classified as gums or pectins, found in a whole host of different plant foods. Every plant food has its own type of water-soluble fiber. And typically, the water-soluble fibers are found in the softer fruits and vegetables. The sort of poster vegetable for water-soluble fiber is okra. And that's why okra is so slimy. That slimy quality is the water-soluble fiber, protects us against heart disease, diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, colitis, and cancers. And then you have the water-insoluble fibers, which are celluloses, hemicelluloses found in your grains, legumes, and other coarser plant foods. And that protects against colon cancers, breast cancer, constipation, diverticulitis, diverticulosis, hemorrhoids, and inflammatory bowel disease, and also helps improve our immunity. And we also know that the bacteria will act on these phytochemicals in our plant foods to make them more bioavailable. So studies have shown that breast cancer risk is decreased by 22% in women who have the highest lignin intake. Lignin is a form of fiber that is found in a variety of plant foods, particularly grains and legumes. Whole grain rye decreased prostate specific antigen or PSA by up to 14% in men with prostate cancer. Consumption of soy phytoestrogen has been shown to reduce both breast cancer and prostate cancer in a dose-dependent fashion, meaning the more you eat, the lower the risk reduction. And metabolism of these phytoestrogens by bacterial strains in our colon will make them more available and absorbable. And those bacterial strains that are most efficient at doing that are those in people who habitually eat a plant-based diet. And what I want to show you here is that when you're eating a high-fiber diet, it stimulates your body to make a much thicker layer of mucus, which means that it lifts up the bacteria and removes them away from your colonic cells. But the thing I want you to notice is when you look at those colon cells, you see how tightly they are joined to each other. And that means that the bacteria and bacterial compounds can't slide down between those colonic cells and get into your bloodstream here at the bottom. And the reason is that colon cells prefer to get their energy from this compound called butyrate, which is made by bacteria when they break down plant fiber. So colon cells don't get their energy primarily from the bloodstream. They get it from the butyrate that's made by breaking down plant fiber. And that's why in order to have a very healthy colon, you have to have a lot of plant fiber. And we see that the mucus can inhibit the bad bacteria, and it also, the fiber helps promote the healthy types of bacteria, and keeps us from getting a lot of the inflammatory compounds that come from a low fiber diet. So let's look at what happens when you don't eat enough fiber. Well, when you don't eat enough fiber, number one, you don't have a thick layer of mucus, but you look at those colon cells. Because they are not getting enough energy, they become sick and weak, and they lose their ability to maintain tight junctions. And you see bacteria actually slipping down between the colon cells into your bloodstream. That is what leaky gut is. It comes from not eating enough fiber. And that markedly ramps up the amount of inflammation in your body, which over time produces disease. It also allows the bad or aberrant strains of bacteria to develop, and they are less able to produce neurotransmitters, which also are important for mental health. So studies that have looked at people who have depression versus those who don't show that people who have depression have higher levels of antibodies against something called lipoprotein polysaccharide, which is a bacterial antigen. And so in essence, what it is telling us is that when people get this leaky gut mechanism, it markedly ramps up the amount of inflammation in their body, and they are more prone to becoming depressed. All right. Well, this is important for another reason. This picture shows you the areas around the world where people eat the most meat. The darker the area, the more meat and animal protein they eat. Why is that important? It's important because the more meat a population eats, the higher the risk of Alzheimer's and other dementias. So you see around the world, those countries and nations where people eat the most animal food, they have the highest prevalence and the highest risk for developing dementia. Whereas in the areas where people have a more plant-based diet, their risk of Alzheimer's and other dementias is markedly decreased. And this is, again, because our gut is directly connected to our brain. Studies have shown that the bacteria in the gut manufacture a number of important neurotransmitters that help keep our brain healthy, reduce the risk for dementia, anxiety, and depression. And this just shows that when you look at dementia in people, the inflammatory markers are highest in people with mild to moderate dementia, whereas normal people have the lowest levels of inflammation in their bodies. So again, super important. You want to ward off dementia, eat your plants. All right, worried about physiology. Do carnivores worry about fat and cholesterol? No, they don't, because no matter how much fat and cholesterol you feed them, they will never develop heart disease. They don't develop gallstones because they have super strong bile, which helps keep them from developing gallstones. One of the reasons that bear bile came to be used in Chinese medicine is that the bile bear bile is so strong. If a human being with gallstones drinks bear bile, our bodies will take that bile and concentrate it and store it in the human gallbladder, where it will actually dissolve human gallstones. That's why they started doing that. We now have medicines that do the same thing, so we don't have to kill bears, but that's just to show you how important or how different animals that are designed to eat meat and fat are from humans. They can take preformed vitamin A, detoxify it, and they manufacture their own vitamin C. We cannot detoxify vitamin A, nor can we manufacture vitamin C. They produce urine that's up to 2.5 times more concentrated than us, and that's what allows them to eat protein without causing themselves to become dehydrated. And also, eating animal protein does not cause them to develop osteoporosis the way it does in human beings. By contrast, only plant eaters have carbohydrate and digesting enzymes in their saliva. Only plant eaters have an appendix. An appendix is part of the gastrointestinal immune system. We cannot detoxify vitamin A, but we can take beta carotene and form it into vitamin A. We can detoxify a wide range of plant alkaloids. Plants tend to put compounds in their tissues to try to prevent their tissues from being eaten by insects and other animals. And if you're going to eat these plants, you have to have the ability to break them down. That's why we love things like garlic and onions, but if you feed those things to your cats or your dog, it'll kill a cat because it'll cause them to get hemolytic anemia, and it'll make dogs very sick. As I said, we can make a vitamin A from beta carotene, but we have to have a dietary source of vitamin C because we don't make our own. We cannot eat putrefying flesh. And of course, we easily develop heart disease if we eat diets high in saturated fat and cholesterol, but we can break fiber down into these beneficial short chain amino acids. So I just want to end by talking about the impact of racism on the health profiles of people of color. And we know that racism has both individual and society-wide effects. And some of the most destructive effects of this system, systemic and systematic racism and racial profiling is on how society views and treats people of color. This negative imaging over a lifetime leads to the belief in the larger society that these targeted groups either don't deserve or not entitled to or even capable of having better health or healthy lives. I mean, people hear about the higher rates of disease in communities of color, and they just kind of shrug their shoulders like, yeah, well, you know, that's what you expect. And even people of color, to some extent, kind of think, well, you know, everybody in my family has diabetes. Everybody in my family has heart disease. Everybody in my family, you know, strokes run in our family. Not realizing the reason that diseases run in families is because eating habits run in families. Unrelenting negative messaging and images create an internalized self-destructiveness that manifests itself in 4 principal ways. There's what I call nihilism, which is the thinking that, you know what, everybody in my family dies young, everybody around me dies young, so it doesn't matter what I'm doing, I'm just gonna party until the end comes. Then there's the normative post-colonization dietary lifestyle patterns, where we think that, you know, things like soul food or the way that our family is eating is the way that we're supposed to eat, instead of understanding that this was something that was inflicted upon us through the process of colonization. Or there's what I call the aspirational or assimilation lifestyle and dietary patterns. So we say, well, you know what? I want to be like everybody else, or I want to be like the rich people. So I'm going to eat steaks and seafood and lobster and drink, you know, champagne and all this crap. And that stuff is as equally destructive. And we also need to understand that living in a racist society causes changes in our genes that predispose us to health problems. This has been documented, that racial profiling, living in a racist society, actually turns on disease promoting genes. And the society-wide effects of racism are reflected in government policies and standards that directly neglect, ignore, or harm minority individuals and communities in ways that ultimately result in poor health. So again, nihilism is the belief that nothing you do will ultimately matter because the odds are so stacked against you. You can't win, so you might as well have a good time. It's a form of PTSD, and this results in drug and alcohol abuse, poor eating habits, can cause domestic and social violence, and lead people to ignore and neglect their health. And there may be a distrust of the medical profession because of historical abuses and traumas that we've been inflicted upon us, like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Now, this brings up the idea of so-called soul food. When you look at the health profiles of African Americans, typically we're more prone to heart disease, diabetes, cancers, and so forth. Why is that? Is it because we're eating so much worse than everybody else? Well, not really, because the studies show that the diets of African Americans are comparable to standard Western diets in terms of composition. There is some evidence that we do tend to eat more red and processed meat, fried foods, sugar-sweetened beverages, and we have don't take in as much unprocessed grains, legumes, fruits, and vegetables, but that's frequently because we are confined to areas where those foods aren't as readily available as fast foods or processed foods. And that has a huge impact on our health. So when you look at Black people living in the United States and the United Kingdom versus Black people living in West Africa, so the point is you're dealing with the same gene pool, but you see markedly different rates of disease. So in green, we see Blacks living in the Western countries versus Blacks still living in West Africa, eating a more traditional West African style diet, which is again, a diet that is based on whole grains, legumes, green leafy vegetables, and has limited amounts of meat and contains no dairy. Well, what happens with pre-diabetes and diabetes? Glucose intolerance is pre-diabetes. Off the charts in the Western countries, barely known, 4% in West Africa. Same thing with diabetes. Very high prevalence of diabetes. NIDDM stands for non-insulin dependent diabetes or type 2 diabetes. Very prevalent in the Western countries, almost unknown in West Africa amongst those eating traditional West African diets. Now, so-called soul food is peculiar to the African American community. It typically includes things like chitlins, oxtails, neck bones, pig's feet, and other high-fat, high-salt, and sugar-laden foods. And people think that this is, traditional food for Black people. But in fact, this was food that was foisted on us when we were confined to those slave labor camps that they call plantations. West Africans brought to America were forced to eat the literal garbage of the plantations, which is why they were given the feet and the ears and the tails and the bones from the neck. And granted, they, God bless them, showed ingenuity, resolve, and did their best to take this garbage and make it into something acceptable to eat. But the problem is that after slavery ended, instead of leaving that type of food on the plantation, we claimed it, called it soul food, and it's really a dietary vestige of slavery. And it is destroying our health, and it's plantation food. It's not our true heritage, and we need to get rid of it and get back to plant-based diets. And what we see is that most versions of ethnic cuisines that are seen in Western countries are in reality post-colonization versions of those cuisines. Traditional Thai or Mexican or Chinese food is not so heavily meat-centered. It is usually centered around plant foods like grains and legumes and contains limited amounts of meat. But in order to appeal to Europeans and Westerners, these diets have been corrupted so that they are loaded with dairy foods, which typically weren't used prior to European colonization, and also containing, excuse me, huge amounts of animal tissue, which again was not part of the traditional diets. And as a result, this creates a lot of disease. Traditional ethnic disease were typically low-fat, plant-based diet built around whole grains, legumes, vegetables containing limited amounts of animal protein. And we need to get back to that because that is what promotes health. So, in conclusion, I just want to say that when you look at the way that we typically eat, we have really abdicated responsibility for our health and the health of our children by allowing these profit-driven marketing campaigns from these fast food companies and other processed distributors of processed foods to dictate how we eat and feed our family. We gorge on these unhealthy foods, stuff our children full of misnamed Happy Meals till they start to look like pint-sized Michelin men, and then we throw our hands up in despair when they and we develop asthma, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, cancers, depression, and other chronic ailments. The things that we have to realize is that chronic diseases that afflict us did not fall from the sky at the behest of a malevolent God. They are the consequences of our own actions. And as such, it is within our power to change our behavior and improve our health. Please remember, we were all born without preferences. Nobody asked for fried chicken, ice cream, or pork chop in the delivery room. Everything we think we like, somebody taught us to like. The unhealthy things we eat, we had to learn to like. We can unlearn those bad habits and we can learn to like healthy foods instead. We can change for the better. We must do this not only for our own benefit, but also for the health and well-being of our children, for the planet and its other inhabitants, and most importantly, for our spiritual health and connection and connectedness to our God. So I like to end my lectures oftentimes by talking about Naaman, which many of you will remember. Naaman was a captain in the Syrian army, and he developed leprosy. And in biblical times, leprosy was not only a death sentence, but it was a horrible way to die because basically your body slowly rotted and pieces of your body fell off until finally the disease killed you. And because it was so contagious, once you developed leprosy, you were banished to a leper colony. You could not even associate with regular society. And when Naaman came down with leprosy, it was fortunate that he had a servant girl who was a Hebrew. And she told him, she said, you know, there is a prophet in Israel, speaking of Elisha, who, if you went to see him, I'm sure he would be able to heal you of your leprosy. So Naaman gathered together this huge retinue of spices, costly fabrics, gold, and so forth, and went journeyed from Syria into Israel to the place where Elisha lived, and sent his servant to explain why he was there. So servant went out, spoke to Elisha, explained the whole situation, and Elijah said, go back and tell him to bathe in the River Jordan 7 times, and he'll be healed. And when the servants came back and told Naaman that, Naaman was furious. He's like, I came all this way, brought all this stuff, and this man won't even come out of that hut to come talk to me? And why should I go bathe in the River Jordan, which is basically a muddy stream compared to some of the big, huge, beautiful rivers we have in Syria? And he was just about to stomp off when his servants came to him and said, and the servants came near and spake unto him and said, my father, if the prophet had bid thee do some great thing, wouldn't you have done it? In other words, if he had told you to go out and kill 16 bears or fight a lion or travel, around the then known world, you would have gladly have done that to be healed. He said, how much rather than when he saith to thee, wash and be clean? In other words, why not do the simple thing that he asks you to do and see what happens? Naaman thought about it, and he realized that they were right, and he went and he bathed in the River Jordan, and when he came up the 7th time, the Bible says his leprosy was cleansed. And I find this story so moving because when we get sick, we're willing to let people crack open our chest, pull veins out of our legs and reroute the plumbing of our heart. We're willing to take toxic chemotherapies or let them cut off, half of our organs to try and regain health, when really all we need to do is the simple thing God asked us to do at the beginning, and that is eat a plant-based diet. So lastly, I'll leave you with the words God spoke to Adam and Eve. He said, behold, I'm giving you every plant yielding seed which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. Genesis 1:29. And generally, the reason we need question and answer sessions is because sometimes we say one thing, but despite our best efforts, people hear something else entirely, just like this slide. Guy's drowning in a river, and he says, Lassie, get help. Lassie went for psychiatric counseling. So with that, I will take any questions anyone has.
Okay, if you have a question, you can unmute yourself and ask. If you're on the phone and you would like to ask a question, just press *9 and I will be able to unmute you so you can ask your question to Dr. Mills. Thank you, Dr. Mills. This has been wonderful. All right, any questions? Okay. All right. Someone said that they weren't able to unmute. Try to unmute now, please.
All right. Thank you, Paula. Thank you so much, Dr. Mills. So appreciate it. I'm glad it's being recorded because I feel like I need to go back and review some of it. Oh, wait, now you're muted. Wait, just a second, stop talking. Can you unmute Dr. Mills, Paula?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Just a second, Dr. Mills, you're still muted. Okay, there you go. What were you saying, sir? Still can't hear him.
He's muted.
Yeah, Paula.
So I put in the request to unmute and you should be able to unmute.
I'm unmuted, but can Dr. Mills be unmuted?
Okay, how about that?
Can
you hear me now?
Go.
Okay.
All I was saying was that, yes, my lectures are designed with a lot of information so that people can take their time and go back through them and review the data. So don't, you cannot possibly take in all this at just one hearing, but I want it to be a resource so that you can refer back to it and just continually glean additional information.
Dr. Mills, I'm wondering about, I saw it on one of the slides under like fiber, but I'm wondering about soy, like tofu, as some of us vegetarians may utilize that for protein. What's your thought on that?
All of the studies and even the meta-analyses where they pool together studies and look at them have shown time and again, soy is healthy for both men and women. And let me explain why. Now, first of all, the reason some people raise objections or have concerns about soy is they're like, well, it's got those plant estrogens. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask people all the time, how do you get milk from a cow? Do you just walk up to her and say, hey, Bessie, give me a glass of milk? She's got to be pregnant. And if she's pregnant, that means her body is full of not plant estrogens, real estrogen. But when you actually look at the way both dairy and beef cows are raised in this country, they're not only full of real estrogen, they're given synthetic estrogens because that makes them grow faster, grow bigger, and produce more milk. So when you're eating animal foods, dairy products, you are getting overloaded with real estrogens, and studies show that actually, you know what? Let me, as they say, let's go to the videotape. Let me pull up this slide. Hold on.
Hold on.
Let's see. Where's my slide on dairy? Here we go.
Dr. Mills?
Yes.
This is Derek. We're not able to see the slide that you're calling for.
You're not?
No, actually, we haven't been able to see it.
No, I was actually seeing it.
Okay. No, because you should still be able to see it because the share is still on. So let me try this
Before
again.
Derek started talking. Okay, there
Can
it
you
is.
see that?
There it is.
Yeah. All right. So number one, you see from this first slide
I can't see it.
that
No.
you guys still can't see it?
We see a panorama of slides, and that's all we've been able to see. The entire presentation is a whole bunch of them, but we haven't been able to see when you call on a specific slide, that particular slide, because the print is so tiny. We just see the whole bunch of slides, but we can't see.
You don't see the individual slides because it should be.
Now, I'm having a different experience, Dr. Mills. I saw exactly the way you were presenting it, slide by slide. I didn't see the whole panorama until you wanted me to see that.
Right.
What about you, Paula?
Yeah, I'm seeing all of the slides as well.
You're not seeing, like right now, you're not seeing just a single slide?
No.
Right now I see risk factors, animal hormones,
that's what you should
cortisol.
See. And then,
I see one slide at a time, like a regular presentation.
Well, in that little red circle, what you see is that a glass of milk has 176 nanograms of actual estrogen and 78 nanograms of cortisol. Over the lifetime of a Western woman, if she's drinking milk, her estrogen exposure from these dairy products will be 4 times greater than a woman living in rural Chinese, which makes her breast cancer risk 5 times greater. For men, instead of breast cancer, think prostate cancer, because estrogens actually increase the risk for prostate cancer. And so when you look at milk and breast cancer risk, again, more milk a country drinks, higher the risk of breast cancer. Well, a recent study of 53,000 women showed that and it was conducted for 8 years, showed a marked increase in breast cancer risk associated with drinking milk. If a woman drank as little as 1/4 to 1 cup of milk per day, she increased her risk of breast cancer by 30%. If she went up to 1 cup per day, the breast cancer risk went up by 50%. And if she drank 2 or 3 cups of milk per day, the breast cancer risk was increased by 80%. And dairy product consumption is the leading risk factor for prostate cancer. And African-American men already have a 60% higher risk of prostate cancer than white men. And once we get it, we're more than twice as likely to die. And it's because of the exposure to these natural and synthetic hormones in these dairy products, and the fact that the dairy protein causes our body to make more of a hormone called insulin-like growth factor 1, or IGF-1, that stimulates the growth and progression of both breast and prostate cancer, as well as testicular cancer, uterine and ovarian cancer. So there's no question that the actual hormones come from the dairy products. But what about those plant estrogens? Well, it turns out that, number one, women have 2 estrogen receptors. There's estrogen receptor 1, which is what's responsible for, causing a woman's breast to grow, giving her curves, and those characteristics. But when overstimulated, will increase the risk for breast cancer. Then there's estrogen receptor 2. That's the one that helps you build stronger bones. Well, the phytoestrogens will bind to estrogen receptor 1, but they do not activate it. So when they bind it, they actually prevent it from being stimulated by real estrogen, and that lowers your breast cancer risk. But interestingly, when those plant estrogens bind to estrogen receptor 2, they do activate that receptor, and that's the one that helps your bones take up more calcium and remain strong throughout your life. So the plant estrogens are doing exactly what God intended for them to do, keeping you healthy.
Well,
And we also know that plant estrogens also lower the risk of prostate cancer in men. So you can eat your soy without fear. Now, you shouldn't eat only soy. I mean, because all plants have something good in them, but absolutely, soy is healthy for humans.
Got it. Got it. Thank you.
So as a Dr. Mills, as a man, I can eat plenty tofu, huh?
With no problem. You know what I tell people? What is which countries around the world eat the most soy products?
Asian.
Right. China's the most populous country in the world. The men ain't wearing bras. And clearly with 1.7 billion people, they have no problem getting busy. Okay?
That's right.
So if you want to have a healthy body and a healthy sex life, do what the Chinese do. Eat your soy.
Okay.
All right. Any other questions?
Well, we want to have you back again. Touch of Health definitely really appreciated this presentation.
Okay.
It was excellent, very detailed. It was just good. And I know the listeners really enjoyed it.
Yes.
Well,
Also,
wonderful. And as I said, it's specifically designed so that people can refer back to it and watch it, multiple times and gain additional information from it. And I know that we already have me scheduled to be back on the 3rd of December, but I'm happy to work with you guys whenever, because this is God's work and it's all good.
well, we
Okay,
thank
we
you.
have one more question.
Oh, sure.
From James. James, go ahead, please.
I can't hear James. Okay. Go ahead, James. Can you guys hear his question?
No, James, you're muted.
Oh, yeah, he is. Okay, there we go.
There he is. Uh-huh.
James, what's your question?
Paula, did he type it? Maybe you could read it.
So I will look down in the comments to see. He raised his hand. And it looked like he had a question, but maybe not. Are there any more questions for Dr. Mills?
Yes. Well, one of the questions I have is for the recording. Hopefully the recording will show it slide by slide so I can see the whole presentation slide by slide. It would help. And thank you so much, Dr. Milton Mills.
My pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. I have tons of questions, but I won't take up everyone's time.
What's your name? What's your name?
Me, Shannon Jones?
Oh, okay, Shannon.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Oh.
No. I won't ask any more questions right now for the sake of time, but thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We did get another question in,
Okay.
and this is from James. The question was about soy and fibroids.
Uh-huh.
And they're still typing in the question, but can you talk a little bit about that? Is there a relationship between soy and fibroids?
Again, because soy binds to but does not activate the estrogen receptor, soy will help reduce the risk for or severity of fibrocystic disease. And again, everything that I'm telling you guys, I want you to do your own research, Google these topics, because you will see that what I'm telling you is true. So again, a woman with a problem with fibroids, if she's having flare-ups, it's not the soy. It's typically that she's still eating dairy or other meat or animal protein, and or she has too much fat in her diet, because high levels of fats will increase what's called arachidonic acid, which increases inflammation and pain. So you have to do, I mean, you can't do this half-baked. This is a church group, so I gotta be good. You gotta do the whole thing, okay? I tell people, whole wheat bread is good for you, but if you put arsenic in it, it's gonna kill you, okay? So you can't have some good and some bad. You've got to eliminate all of those disease-promoting components to allow your body to heal itself and become healthy.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, we have another question. Sandranita, you can go ahead.
Sure. No, just a minute.
She muted herself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, there you go.
Just a minute. Just a moment.
You have too many devices going on, Sandranita.
Right. My question is in the chat.
All right.
Okay.
I will look in the chat. All right. Thank you for an excellent presentation. How do you begin to abstain from sugar?
I mean, that's a tough one, because we like sugar. And so the first thing you do, you got to pray and ask God to help you break that addiction. And then try to use, I think, more natural forms and healthier forms of sweetness to satisfy the craving. So instead of reaching for, like for instance, let's talk about beverages. Can y'all see this? There we go.
Oh, yeah.
Perrier. Yeah, I needed to break my addiction to soda pop. So I get Perrier or Pellegrino, and it satisfies that desire for something fizzy, but it doesn't have any sugar in it. There are sparkling waters that are flavored, which can give you, the berry taste, orange, or whatever you want, again, without the sugar. Try to have, instead of dessert after dinner, some fruit to help, give you what you desire in terms of a sweet taste without the artificial and added sugar. And it will typically take you about a good month to really find that your tastes change. And there's a reason for that. Every 21 days, our body completely replaces all of your taste buds. And so it takes that long for your brain to reprogram itself and readjust, okay? So be patient, give it time. You may have to lay on the ground and kick and scream like somebody going through withdrawals, but hang in there and pray, and you will get over it.
Thank you.
Okay.
Are there any more questions? You can raise your hand, or if you want to type it into the chat, you can do that as well. No, Shannon said she had some questions.
Well, I have a question about B12. I often, as vegetarian, people will say things about protein. We know that comes up often? How do you get your protein and those kinds of things? But then also I want, but I won't ask about that. I'm more curious about the B12 because that's been brought up to me also.
Sure. All right. So again, I just want to reiterate, check out my lecture on protein. It should answer all your questions, including what are good plant-based sources of protein. But people will bring up B12 because they say, well, what about B12? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, what about it? What about heart disease? What about cancer? What about diabetes? What about strokes? B12 is a vitamin we need in minuscule amounts, but it is critically important for health. Well, it turns out that B12 is not made by plants. It's also not made by animals. B12 is only made by bacteria. And so natural sources of B12 are bacteria. But where do we live? We live in concrete, steel, and plastic, jungles that we created where we sterilize our water, we sterilize everything we eat. So we've eliminated the natural sources of B12. That's why if we were living in a natural environment, eating stuff we pulled off trees and out the ground and drinking water from streams, we'd be getting plenty of B12. But we don't live there. So we've eliminated those sources. That's the only reason we have to take a supplement. And any B12 you find in animal foods came from bacteria too. So just bypass the animal and get it from the supplement.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Glad you asked that question because that's an important question. Because people think, I got you. You ain't got nothing.
Okay, we have another question. Does soy affect thyroid function if hypothyroid?
Okay, that's a good question. And I'm going to say I don't know the answer to that. But what I will tell you is that I have met several women who were afflicted with an underfunctioning thyroid who, when they went plant-based, resolved that problem. But thyroid function is important. So again, what I will say is that it's best to have that monitored by a physician, hopefully a plant-based physician, who can make sure that your thyroid is either functioning adequately or you're on adequate replacement. But again, ladies and gentlemen, remember it's if you're not eating an entirely plant-based diet, the problems are likely coming from all of those added hormones and synthetic compounds and toxins that are in the plant foods. Because what I do know is that a lot of the concentrated environmental toxins that people get in their animal foods will interfere with thyroid function. And once you eliminate those toxins from your diet, it allows your thyroid to function in a healthier manner. But I would really want to direct you to work on that directly with a doc to make sure that you're not under hypothyroid or hyperthyroid.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Are there any more questions? Looks like I haven't gotten any more questions.
All right. Well, it is because it's almost 11:30 here. So I again thoroughly enjoyed this, and I'm glad it was very useful and helpful, and I'm sure we'll be working together more in the future.
Yes.
Thank you again.
My pleasure. And you guys, oh, by the way, you can check out my website, Dr. Milton Mills, plantbasednation.com. Again, Dr. Milton Mills, plantbasednation.com. No spaces, no dots. And it'll have a lot of good resources on there for you as well. And there should be a way to submit questions to me via the website as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
We're going to turn the meeting over to Brother Derek to close this out. And I just want to say again, thank you so much, Dr. Mills.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. And
Thank you.
Yes,
Well,
thank you for hosting. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paula.
Yay.
Well, thank all of you for participating. We just want to give you a friendly reminder to keep up with Touch of Health, and we have more to come. And like Dr. Mills said, we'll be seeing him again, hopefully in December. So keep listening and watching, and God bless. And I'm going to offer a word of prayer. Father, we thank you for this message. We really take it to heart, how that you really want to change our life for the better, how that we can have better communication with you by doing what you asked us to do.
Amen.
So we just thank you for something very simple you made. Just eat healthy, eat right, and we can hear more from you. So help us to do that. In Jesus' name we ask and pray. Amen. And
Amen. All right. God bless you guys, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Thanks, Paula. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everybody. Bye, Shannon. Look at Dr. Mill. Look at her. Bless her heart. You should read the thing.
Oh, my stars. Good night.
What's the date?
Okay, bye, guys. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Bye.
Bye.